Good afternoon. My name is Neil Hume. I am the Natural Resources Editor of the Financial Times, and I'll be your moderator for this session. It's called From the Mine to Steel to End Products, How to Decarbonise the Entire Value Chain. Now, steelmaking is one of the industrial activities contributing most to climate change. In aggregate, iron and steelmaking accounts for 7 to 9% of all direct fossil fuel emissions. As such, there is a critical need to decarbonise the steel industry. The good news is that after years of research, several technologies are approaching commercial readiness. Some believe hydrogen could hold the key to one day eliminating greenhouse gas pollution from the production of steel. And leading the charge to develop this novel and more energy efficient low carbon manufacturing technique are Sweden's SSAB and LKAB. So I think it's fair to say that hydrogen DRI, route of pig iron production, is fast emerging as the leading technical option to decarbonise steel production and help get steel companies to their ambition of net zero carbon dioxide emissions. However, there's been limited discussion about the economics of this transformation, and that's probably not surprising as there's not an industrial scale hydrogen DRI plant in operation in the world, although that will happen later in the decade. Overall, the cost of decarbonising the steel industry are huge and possibly beyond the means of many producers who are already operating on razor-thin margins. This means regulators and markets will have to play a part if the steel industry is to stand any chance of going green. And of course, all this matters because steel is still the most important metal in the modern world. And as we know, has been one of the key drivers of the transformation of civilization over the last 3 millennia. So before we begin, let me introduce the panelists for this session. We have Andreas Oragnell, Chairman of Hybrid. We have from LKAB, its Chief Executive, Jan Mostrom. From Volvo Group, we have Nicholas Wahlberg, VP of System Solutions and Partnerships. From the International Energy Agency, we have Aracelia Fernandez-Pilar, Head of Technology Innovation Unit, and finally, Ovais Samar, Deputy Executive Secretary from the UNFCCC. So the format for this session will run as follows. We're going to hear from each of the panelists in turn before we move on to a discussion. Towards the end of the session, we'll also take some questions from the floor. Now, I believe Ovais is pushed for a bit of time, so I would like to welcome him first to the floor. And if you could give your address, thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And greetings to everyone from Glasgow here in COP26, and it's intense, I can tell you that. And I'm very pleased that all of you are able to join at this event, and happy to share a few thoughts to the EU partners, LKAB, Swedish Mining Company, and the Hybrid. I won't attempt to pronounce the full names of all of that because my pronunciation won't be very good. So it's a pleasure to address you during this pivotal moment we currently find ourselves at for climate change and for humanity's future. And that's why we are here in Glasgow for COP26. And COP26 is really a crucial moment for the implementation of Paris Agreement and addressing this crisis. We are cautiously optimistic as of the half stage of the conference. There's still another week to go. Ministers will arrive over the weekend, and some very important and tough decisions will have to be made. So we are working very, very diligently and closely with everyone involved to get to a positive outcome. And you have seen the public awareness and the demand for action is growing every day. People understand that the climate crisis is not an abstract issue somewhere in the distance, but it's happening here and now. This is why yesterday and today saw millions of people right now outside in the roads. There are millions of people, especially the young and old and everybody, who are striking around the world to convey a very strong message to the leaders and to policymakers and private sector and every one of us. Since the beginning of COP26 last Sunday, it's been a week, we have seen some very important and encouraging announcements. I will mention one in particular. The United States joined Britain, France, Germany, and the European Union on Tuesday in a multi-billion-dollar partnership to help South Africa finance a quicker transition from coal. The initiative is valued at something like $8.5 billion. And at least 25 countries and public finance institutions have committed to ending international public support for unabated fossil fuel energy sector by 2022. Planned new coal generation globally has fallen by 76% since the Paris Agreement, which shows it is working. Where willingness exists, we must implement it to make it even more stronger. We now have a window of opportunity to solve the problem, especially in these unprecedented times with the resources, the technologies, and the knowledge we have today. It is now for the first time possible to truly bend the emissions curve rapidly across many of the most carbon intensive sectors. Hybrid is an outstanding example for this. Hybrid, representatives of those who are online today, takes one of those oldest trades in the world, which is steel making, and brings it into 21st century. Steel making has, as we all know, undergone a succession of gradually improved production methods, but all of them have had in common a very large, unfortunately, carbon footprint. Today, the steel value chain accounts for between 7 to 9% global greenhouse gas emissions. If hybrid becomes the new standard, this number will drop to zero. And I cannot overstate the significance of this type of technology breakthroughs. From what we are doing here in COP26, the success means two things. First, we are seeking to conclude the negotiations of the fine print of the Paris Agreement, which will make the Paris Agreement fully operational and release its full potential. And secondly, we bring together the world of climate action, leaders and everybody, all stakeholders across the sectors, as diverse as energy and transportation to sports and fashion, and the list goes on. All of them deeply committed to fully align their businesses and the supply chains to meet the goals of Paris Agreement. This may be more or less challenging for different sectors, but they all have in common a firm commitment with clear trajectories for how they will achieve these goals. But then there are hard to abate sectors, such as cement, aviation, and indeed steel. For many years, we have heard that this type of activities are essential for society and impossible to abate from the climate footprint equation. Times are changing, circumstances and knowledge are changing, and that was impossible 10 years ago. And what was impossible 10 years ago, it is very much possible now. The impossible becomes possible. Hybrid goes even several steps further. It not only sets a net zero target for the future, but it implements the new technology fully across one of the most important steel production chains in Europe. This is climate action in action. And really, that's what I strongly believe in. And I encourage many, many companies who are around the world, and especially in unabated sectors, to come forward and do the same. And if for a green restart of the economy, especially in smart and climate-friendly way, it is important to engage as many stakeholders as possible in a collaborative manner. It is critical to take the opportunity of the very significant recovery funds that have now been committed by many, many governments around the world to restart the world's economies following the COVID pandemic, to not go back to business as usual, but to listen to science and to the people on the streets and create a better world for the future. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and once again, thank you. And I state this is the challenge we have ahead of us to bring the outstanding example of hybrid to the world and to make its adoption part of the climate action and every steel producing country and company around the world. I wish you a fruitful discussion and thank you very much for joining us today, and do everything you can to raise your voices and your ambition so that we get out of Glasgow with a very solid outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ovais. Now, I would like to call upon Jan Mostrom, CEO of LKAB, to take the floor now and give us his opening remarks. Jan, over to you.
Yep, thank you. I think you put the slide on. Yes, here we have. I will talk about the future of LKAB, but if we go to the next slide, a few words about the company. We were founded 1890 in the Arctic part of Sweden, and that means that we consider us as an iron ore company, even if we have a quite substantial footprint as suppliers of industrial minerals, mainly in Europe, UK, and we have a presence both in United States and in Asia. But iron ore is our core business. Last fiscal year, we produced just below 30 million tons of iron ore, and that is, in a global perspective, of a volume of almost 2 billion tons, not much. But we are number 2 on the seaborne iron ore pellets market, and that is perhaps one of the reasons and the key drivers for us to maintain efficiency and competitiveness, being one of the few underground mine operators. We have always been on the forefront regarding methodologies, methods, processes, equipment, both in mining and in metallurgical performance. We started as lump ore producers back in the early 1900s. As the market changed, we started to produce fines, and the past years we have been mainly an iron ore pellet producers with almost 25 million tons annually. But when we started to develop the guidelines for the planning period 2030 to 2060, because that is the next planning period for us as a mining company to develop and increase our ore reserves, or mineral reserves, as we say in the business. We started to put out the guidelines. How will the market and the expectations on us as a company be in the 2030, 2060s? Even if we today is among those who has the absolute smallest footprint regarding environmental and climate footprint, we are quite substantial as an especially carbon dioxide emitter. Today we are number 4 in Sweden. We emit in the range of 600,000 to 700,000 tons of carbon dioxide from our pelletization plants. So what we started to develop the guidelines is how to substantially decrease our environmental climate footprint, and also to increase our revenues and substantially increase our productivity, because continue underground mining more than 1 kilometer below the surface takes its toll in investments. If we go to the next slide. The next logical step for us would be to increase our revenues and starting to increase the quality and the premium product which we deliver, going from iron ore pellets into spong iron. And one important part in our work in that guidelines was how to combine our climate impact with the increased revenues, increased premium products when we was contacted by SSAB and asked if we would like to participate in not just conventional direct reduction, but in direct reduction with pure hydrogen, and develop technology for that. And of course that fitted very well into our strategy. So that was one of our key findings for this planning process 2030-2060, to develop our operations or our company from an iron ore producer to a spong iron producer. If we go to the next slide, important for us to maintain sustainable operations. In our ores, we have a mineral called apatite that has a content of both phosphorus and rare earth elements. And phosphorus is something that the steel producers definitely don't want in iron ore. So today we extract it and put it in our tailings facilities. But going through the guidelines and the possible change in processes, it was obvious that it could be possible to extract this mineral and also produce 2 concentrates, one for phosphorus and one for rare earth elements. And the content of rare earth elements in our ore is mainly those used for permanent magnets, which of course is vital, especially when we are going to electrify the automotive industry. You can also say that one side effect will be that we will be a large producer of gypsum, extremely clean gypsum for the construction industry. If we go to the next slide, if we see that the real impact for us going forward will be to change our product portfolio, and especially to address the emission of carbon dioxide from our pelletization plants. We also had a strong focus on how to improve our mining operations. As I said, today we are operating almost at 1 kilometer's depth, and our plans is go substantially deeper. So we started a collaboration with a series of global leading companies to develop a new world standard for mining, underground mining, with a focus of improved efficiency, productivity, compatibility, but also to be autonomous and electrified. And with that, we start the fossil-free production of steel. We start with the fossil-free efficient underground mines. We will develop our pelletization plants, our beneficiation plants to low carbon production, going up in production to spong iron and also extract critical minerals from mine waste. And if you go to the last slide, that will have a substantial impact. Of course, we will address a lot of those 700,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which we are emitting from our pelletization plants. But the main impact will be if we see our total production flow from LKAB, we will reduce our customers' emission with 35 million tons of carbon dioxide annually, which is roughly 2/3 of the total emission of Sweden. And with that, I end my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Jan. Now we're going to turn to Andreas Ragnar, Chairman of Hybrit now, who is hopefully going to tell us all about the project and exactly how it works and what they are producing. So Andreas, I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you very much. The slides are on. Thank you very much. And I think what Jan just presented is an excellent context and setting the scene for this project, because Jan described kind of the total picture and the total impact of what Hybrit is all about. But if we then go to the next slide, please. So just for those of you that are not fully clear on what Hybrit actually does, this is an overview of the entire value chain, and that's the scope of Hybrit. So we start with iron ore, and the first part of the value chain is of course to do the pellet production fossil free. We've had parts of the project has focused on that with bio oil in that process. The second step, the direct reduction with hydrogen, which is the main part, and I will come back to that a little bit. And then the final step is to take those, as Jan said, sponge iron that you then compress to DRI, and then you turn and then you melt that in an electric arc furnace. And that means that you can make the whole value chain fossil free. If you then deep dive a little bit into the middle piece, the direct reduction, and as Jan also pointed out, direct reduction can be done already today with natural gas, so it's an existing process. And the novelty in our process is that we do it with pure hydrogen in all steps of the value chain, all steps of that process. And it's also, I think it's an important part of it that the project has also been looking at large-scale hydrogen storages, because the electricity consumption of this process is very significant. And I think a full-scale plant can reach up to 1 gigawatt of electricity consumption in total. And that, of course, in a world with a weather-dependent electricity system will be challenging if you need that 24/7. So we believe that the important component of the system is that you combine with hydrogen storages so that you can moderate your consumption of electricity and still have a continuous process in the direct reduction. And just some facts here that if we look at the average global average emissions per tons of steel today, it's about 2.2 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. On average, the Swedish process that already today is very efficient is at 1.6 tons per ton of steel. But with this process, we will get down to 25 kilos of ton of steel. And those few kilos still around is actually gypsum that you need in the process. So there is some fun. It's just hard to avoid those CO2 emissions, but it's on a very, very low level. The second and last slide, if we turn that to that one. Important for us then that what you see, by the way, on the picture behind here is the pilot plant that is already standing in Luleå, where we have already managed to produce fossil-free iron sponge that has then been turned into completely fossil-free steel. And Jan and Anna, the CEO of Adaptation, and Martin Lindqvist, CEO of SSAB, inaugurated that first process a month ago. So we have already produced the world's first fossil-free steel. But to scale this up, and as you said, industrialization is key. There are a few things that we think are important. One is, of course, that there is a robust CO2 price signal. But that then, and it's, of course, because this process is then a new process, and our competitors, if you want, that use the old process, that has still free allowance of CO2 emissions. So, of course, then it's very important that it's a level playing field for front runners like us in the EQS benchmark, so that we don't get penalized because we start on a zero level. We really get the benefit of taking emissions out of the system. And there also needs to be an efficient policy framework to scale up the electricity and thus the fossil-free hydrogen production. Because of course, even if this process exists, if we are to, which we, of course, our objective to transform all of the world fossil-free steel industry to this as global citizens, there is a significant amount of fossil-free electricity that is needed. So yes, there is a need to have a level playing field for the steel and direct reduction players, but also making sure that there is enough electricity in the market. And then finally, of course, to support and create markets for green products where there needs to be ambitious targets, but also very clear definitions and standards. Before we call it fossil-free, what exactly does it mean? And there will be shades of gray, which I think is perfectly makes sense, but there should be clear standarding systems so that there is clarity on how fossil-free or how green product is it that we offer. So we are very optimistic, and I think we've come a long way, but there's still, we need these 3-4 things to as a further tailwind to really succeed as quickly as possible, because that's what we need from a global perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andreas. Now I would like to call on Nicholas from Volvo Group to give us his presentation. Nicholas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. I'll just wait so the slides come up here. That's not my slide. Is there? There it is. There it is. Thank you very much. Very nice to be part of this session, of course, and I represent, as you know, the Volvo Group, and we're very active in the commercial vehicle industry globally. So this topic is very, very interesting for us. If you take the next slide, please. We have set a long-term ambition for the Volvo Group to become and have our products to be 100% safe, 100% fossil-free, and 100% more productive. And this is a very ambitious long-term target, but we're very dedicated and moving along according to this line. If you take the next slide, please. As you know, we are a company that has sustainability in our heart. We have committed to the Paris Agreement, and maybe this is animated, so you can please click 3 or 4 times. Yeah, there it is. Thank you. We're part of the TCFD reporting, the Green Finance Framework, and we earlier this year committed and got our commitments set through the science-based targets. And actually now last week here during the COP26 meeting, signed up to become a part of the First Movers Coalition. So we're very serious in our efforts here to work on the sustainability and the fossil-free world. And if you take the next slide, please. The starting point, if you like, for a company like Volvo Group is, of course, to work on our emissions from our products, our scope 3 emissions. And we've set the target to have a rolling fleet, as we call it, that is fossil-free by 2050. That means that we need to be fossil-free by 2040 with our products, because we have approximately 10-year lifetime of our products on the market. We believe, as basically the whole automotive industry, in electrification, electric propelled vehicles. We are heavily now investing in both battery electric vehicles, but also fuel cell or hydrogen electric vehicles. And we strongly believe that these two technologies that has in common that they're electric propelled, but two different ways of storing the energy, will be the majority of the population going forward. But we also say that we believe that in certain applications, the combustion engine can still be valid, but in that case, then powered or we will not burn diesel in those engines, but rather biofuels or perhaps hydrogen in the combustion engine. And this journey is already ongoing and has started, and we're very, very happy to be part of it. And we believe we're partly leading this transformation now going on this direction. But with that said, we are also looking into now a lot of other dimensions from the fossil-free journey. And of course, in our products, steel is a major part of our products. And we're thereby very, very happy and glad to now have started a relation with the Swedish steel company SSAB, and thereby also connecting us to the hybrid initiative with LKAB and Vattenfall. We actually showed the world a couple of weeks ago the first vehicle built by fossil-free steel. So please, if you take the last picture. This is a vehicle. It's called the Tara, or the TA15 in Volvo language. It is a vehicle now produced with fossil-free steel through SSAB, coming from the hybrid initiative. The vehicle is fully electric, it's fully autonomous, and it's actually produced in a plant in Sweden, which is carbon neutral as a factory. So this is a real joy to have this first vehicle already on the ground, and we will continue now to develop and explore this relation, as we're very dedicated to work with the different partners here in the complete value chain, because we really need to work together to shape the value chain, the fossil-free value chain together going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Okay, we're going to have our final presentation now from the floor, and I'd like to call upon Araceli from the IEA to give us her presentation. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Neil, and pleasure to join this panel, and thanks a lot for the invitation from the IEA. Very happy to be supportive of this initiative and joined indeed the session. My intervention and my few slides go a little bit, taking a bit of a step back and looking at the overall transition for the steel sector in this overall ambition to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And so I'll speak a little bit about that. If we go to the next slide, just to put a couple of words of context in terms of like the global roadmap that the IEA released earlier this year in May, that basically explore what will be the implications and what it will take for the global energy sector to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. And we did that analysis with the idea not to show, let's say, just the ultimate context and what it would entail for the energy sector by 2050, but to really explore in the way what would be the pathway. So we developed and identified more than 400 milestones that could basically bring the whole energy sector, looking at all the different applications, all the different areas of the economy, to reach that ultimate goal and of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, certainly including heavy industries and certainly including the steel sector. If we go to the next slide, just to go a little bit more in the context of heavy industries, of course, it's been mentioned as well, I think in the opening remarks as well, what the importance of heavy industries it is in terms of the CO2 footprint today. We see that within the total industrial sector, heavy industries represent around 2/3 of the total CO2 emissions there. And the steel sector accounts for around 2.6 gigatons of CO2 emissions globally. Of course, these industries produce materials that are essential for the economies and the societies as we understand them today, but also for the economies and the societies as we would understand them in a carbon neutral or a CO2 neutral world. There will be many technologies, many clean energy technologies, many infrastructure developments that will require this type of materials. And so it's essential to look into how we can basically reduce the CO2 footprint of these activities. Certainly, these industries are very fossil fuel intensive today. And this is no surprise when we think about the type of services they need to deliver. So they need to deliver very high temperature heat. They use fossil fuels in some cases, either for feedstock in chemical processes or also as reducing agent in the case of pig iron production. And also as a result or as a consequence of some of these processes, we see as well in some applications, process CO2 emissions being released, as has been mentioned as well by the previous speakers, and not only in the steel sector, but also in cement sector being a notable challenge. And so on top of that, we see as well that many of these industries operate in markets that are international, they are global, and they are very competitive. And so this is where it becomes very important that the regulatory framework would allow for low CO2 technologies and process routes to come into play. But to achieve this very drastic reduction of CO2 emissions in heavy industries in this pathway, that as you see here is around 95%, it really means that to move away from these fossil fuel routes and conventional, like more incumbent process routes, we'll need to introduce alternative pathways, alternative process routes and technologies, as it is hybrid and the one we are discussing today. And you see how that will take some time. We need to develop those technologies as soon as possible, but still will need a bit of time so that to fulfill this pathway, as we explore it at the IEA, you would see that by 2050, around 95% of the production coming from primary sources on these heavy industries will come from innovative routes. So a really complete turnaround in terms of how the industries operate. If you go to the next slide, just to highlight another key challenge from these industries, which is also the fact that most of these assets that produce these materials are quite long-lived. So in the case of steel, you see here what's let's say the average age of different capacity assets organized by region. And we see a typical lifetime of around 40 years. Now, when we look at what's the average age of these assets, particularly blast furnaces and direct reduced iron furnaces across different regions, taking into account what was the last time where they went under, let's say, a major refurbishment, we see this average age between 13 and 14 years. So there's still quite a big gap between that and the 40 years that they would normally operate. And so if we go to the next slide quickly, thanks. Then, of course, this is not only bad news in the sense that one could think that if those assets will keep operating for until this kind of end of their typical lifetime, and under current conditions, we'll see more than 25 gigatons of CO2 emissions put into the atmosphere. This, of course, would completely prevent us being successful in meeting that goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. But of course, there's different interventions that can take place in these assets to adapt them better to new technologies with a lower CO2 footprint. If we manage to align the innovation cycle so that we make sure that those processes are demonstrated at scale by the time that the next investment cycle for these assets will come, we can really bend the curve and put those remaining CO2 emissions underneath that threshold to meet the net zero emissions goal by 2050. To go to the next slide, just quickly to mention that, of course, when we look at heavy industries in general, there would be a suite of solutions that would be required when we think about all these different sectors and all these different regional contexts, all these different starting points in terms of existing assets, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of raw materials and potential market constraints. And so a suite of solutions would be required, particularly hydrogen being a key solution there, also integration of carbon capture and storage for utilization, but also certainly electrification and bioenergy routes. But to highlight again that overall, I mean, most of these avenues would require new developments that are close to the markets or almost reaching the markets, in some cases a bit of earlier stages. And so in terms of CO2 emissions, we'll be talking about a bit more than half of those reductions in heavy industries by 2015, this pathway coming from technologies that are not readily available at the market at scale already today. If we just now go to the next slide, just wanted to make a bit of a final point on hydrogen and what hydrogen means for the transformation of heavy industries, and in particular the iron steel sectors we're discussing today. Certainly, hydrogen is a key alternative and a key pillar for the decarbonization of heavy industries. We see that there is a revived momentum for hydrogen, certainly, and this is not just a, let's say, not tangible momentum. It is a momentum that is backed up with investments. It is a momentum that is backed up with policy ambitions, and it's a momentum that is backed up with very specific and tangible projects, as the one that is being discussed today. So we see, for instance, in the left-hand side graph, you can see what's the low carbon hydrogen production and use in these heavy industries. And we see that only with the projects in the pipeline, given this momentum, we see there's going to be certainly an increase that could be almost falling in the amount of low carbon hydrogen that we would be, let's say, or these industries would be demanding if those pledges and ambitions for net zero would be, let's say, implemented, the ones that have been announced by governments before COP. We know there's been some recent announcements that were not taken into account yet in this analysis. But if we think about the overall ambition of reaching globally net zero emissions, then you see that we are really falling short, and we need to almost triple that low carbon hydrogen use in these heavy industries, with the demand from the steel sector being one of the ones, as you see there in light green, increasing more heavily. So certainly hydrogen-based direct reduced iron production forms really a key CO2 emission reduction strategy for the iron steel sector, but I would say for heavy industries as a whole. Because when we look at the right-hand side graph that looks at total hydrogen demand from industry, then we see that when you compare the 2030 levels between the production that will come from projects in the pipeline and those that would come from this APS scenario, which basically reflects these announced pledges, you see that the levels are very similar. But as I mentioned in the previous slide, when you look at the low carbon hydrogen component of that, we are falling a bit short. So we need to accelerate more the decarbonization of that hydrogen supplies, and certainly increase the level of hydrogen being penetrated in these industries when we look at the ambition to reach net zero emissions by 2050, just in the last two columns there. But just wanted to end my first intervention indicating that certainly it is critical to for governments in a way to look into strategies and instruments to stimulate the demand for hydrogen across different value chains. This is essential to make sure that by stimulating this demand for low carbon hydrogen, we can reduce the cost of producing hydrogen, and at the same time we can also mitigate the risks associated with investments for developing technologies of new uses that would demand hydrogen that are not the typical ones that we see in the market today, that are pretty much based on, let's say, the chemical sector when we think about heavy industries. And so that essential role from governments is critical to make sure that, again, we can lower the cost of producing hydrogen, so that low carbon hydrogen, so that we can make sure that the transition can accelerate. And I'll leave it here, but of course, happy to join the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Araceli. Okay, we're going to get into a sort of discussion now with the panelists. And Andreas, could I come to you first? I'd just like to get a sense of where the hybrid project is at the moment. I mean, you're obviously producing tons at the moment. And when are you going to sort of be up to a commercial scale? And I guess the other key question is, how much more expensive is it to make steel in this fashion than, say, down the traditional blast furnace oxygen route?
If we start with the time plan, I think we've come a long way when it comes to the technological developments through the pilot plant that we have in Luleå. And the plan is that we have our first full scale, if you want, plant ready by 2026. So that's the time that we're working very hard on. And when it comes to how much more expensive, I think that's a moving target. Once upon a time, really early in the project, we calculated that it would be approximately 30% more expensive, but that was the calculation 4 years ago. That was when the CO2 price was much lower. And so I think the gap is getting smaller and smaller, let's put it that way. And I think that maybe it's more relevant to discuss how competitive is this fossil-free technology compared to other fossil-free technologies. Because I think within short, I don't think that the fossil technology will no longer be accepted by many customers. So I think this what we produce in hybrid will compete with other fossil-free alternatives. And there I think that we are very, very, very competitive.
What are those alternatives?
Well, today there aren't very many. I think we're clearly ahead of most others, but there is one other alternative, or in Sweden, H2 Green Steel, that is doing a very similar approach to us. And I'm sure we hear that, for example, some of the big steel companies, they've decided to go for hydrogen-based hydrogen reduction for the future. So I think it is the route that steel and mining companies will choose. And then I would say that we are very, very competitive, thanks to the high-quality iron ore that LKAB has, the availability of electricity, fossil-free electricity in the Nordic/Swedish northern Sweden. That will be, I think already today we have it, but I think also longer term, I think there is a clear competitive advantage for us to generate more electricity than we have today. And combined, I think so the fossil-free competitiveness is extremely high. I think of course, for some years, it will be relevant to compare the fossil-free with the fossil, but I think that's more or less, in a few years, it's not actually the relevant comparison.
Okay. Look, while we're talking about costs, I just wanted to bring Nicholas in here, and just to say, from your perspective at Volvo, I mean, are you prepared to pay a premium for fossil-free steel? Is that something that your customers, do you think, will pay a premium for as well?
Our walking into this equation, and now with the commitments we have made to become fossil-free to 2040, we have to solve this equation and do it together, both through the value chain here, like with Jan and Andreas and SSAB in one stream here, but also, of course, with our customers and our customers' customers. And it's like my CEO normally talks about these different scopes, that scope 3 for Volvo is somebody else's scope 1 or 2 and so on. So the whole equation ties together, and somehow we have our planet and its boundaries, and we have to find the proper ways of moving forward. And of course, it will be, every time you change technology, there is always a cost situation, but we'll have to tackle that together. So yes, we're on to this, and we will continue to proceed, and we believe strongly in going this fossil-free track.
Okay, but is there do customers want this product though? I mean, are they coming to you and saying this is what we want to see in our vehicle? Yeah, they're starting to. I mean, we showed this first vehicle basically 2 weeks ago. So I mean, they haven't had that long time to come to us, to be honest. But yes, our customers are asking and are very. Many of them are very committed to the fossil-free world as well, and of course, they're looking into their chains just like we are, and the fossil-free steel will be very important going forward. Okay, yeah, and could I just bring you in here from the LKAB perspective, because I mean it strikes me that you're in a very advantaged position. You're blessed with high quality iron ore. You are blessed with lots of renewable power nearby. So for you, it is relatively easy to make this jump towards making sponge iron. I wonder if it's as easy for an iron ore producer with low quality fines in the Pilbara to do this, because I guess my question is, you know, it's okay for you to go down this route, but I mean, can the whole industry really go down this route?
Perhaps I would start to answer the question you did not ask me, and the question you asked my colleagues. What will the price and competitiveness be of fossil-free spong iron? What I think we must realize is that we are now in an extremely early stage of direct reduction, both regarding how to produce fossil-free electricity, how to produce fossil-free hydrogen. We today have a technology that is not dimensioned for industrial purpose. It's more about small-scale production. That also goes for direct reduction in the process, so to say. What I see will come is a lot of effort will go into direct reduction with pure hydrogen, how to improve the processes so you can deal with low-grade iron ore. Of course, it will be substantial, much more expensive, I would guess, if you would try to use 55-56% fines and try to do pellets of that, or if you will go to fines to HBIs. But yes, I believe it will be possible to do that.
Okay. Araceli, I'd like to bring you here and just go back to one of your slides where you showed the age of the various steel fleets across the world. I mean, China and India there are very young. Why are they going to, change a 10-year-old blast furnace to go down the hydrogen DRI route with all the costs involved? Won't they look to just run these furnaces longer and actually look to do it more efficiently, use hydrogen injection into the blast furnace? I mean, we're not really going to see the hybrid model rolled out in those countries, are we?
So I think that's a very interesting question. I think there's different strategies that we are seeing, different steel makers are pursuing to adapt their existing fleets. Certainly, I mean, the blast furnace route is the most widely used today. And this is the most numerous type of assets that we see in those type of fleets. And direct reduced iron ore furnaces are more concentrated in certain regions. China clearly dominated by blast furnaces. One could think about different types of strategies to adapt those assets. There could be some that are more intermediate. If we think about injection of hydrogen, as you've mentioned, that have been tested already in different blast furnaces, but also in combination with other types of alternatives there. from waste to different types of biomass products, and certainly also the integration of carbon capture and storage in those type of assets. In terms of direct reduced iron furnaces, this is also a route that is much more used in India, for instance, so within the two regions that you've mentioned. Nowadays, mostly notably based on coal, but we are seeing also different trials to, in a way, adapt first those coal-based facilities more towards gas-based, starting to inject hydrogen. We've seen tests more in the European context, with that reaching up to 30% without the need to make a major, let's say, adjustments in the existing equipment. And that helps already getting more know-how in terms of how to operate the facilities in that respect. But then, of course, there is a bit of somehow like a limit into what you could do with your existing assets and before, let's say, incurring in a major investment. But as I've mentioned, it is quite typical in this sector and other heavy industries where we see this investment cycles every 25 years or so, earlier than this typical lifetime. And when they have, for instance, to, let's say, change the whole lining of a blast furnace, this investment is very big. It, in some cases, can be almost equivalent to a new facility, to a new whole asset. And so it is important that by that time, I mean, there's some adaptations and some, let's say, interventions that can be done until reaching this 25 investment cycle. But when reaching that 25 investment cycle, let's say the options and how they compare from an economic perspective change a little bit, because again, the refurbishment need will be much greater. And so we really see, and we are starting to see, particularly in the European context, this adaptation and a lot of interest to learn from other regions more about these technologies, because in most cases, these alternative routes are mostly developed in the European context, but to learn about what are the constraints, how to operate them, and how they could start thinking about adapting their assets.
Okay. Andreas, just back to you. Let's assume the European steel industry does decide to go down the DRI route. And the cost of that will be, because I've seen something in the region of 90 billion. Then we've got to get to this question of electricity and scaling that up. And, you know, I've got some figures here from Citigroup that it could potentially require sort of 950 billion of investment in order to get the, you know, the additional green electricity that will be needed to go down this route. I mean, how are we going to scale it up and get to that stage? And if anyone else would like to come in after that, yeah.
Of course, the numbers are staggering when you look at the investment needed, but still, I would argue that I don't think that the capital is the constraint. It's actually the resources to do this, both when it comes to people building it, but also all the permissions, finding all the, I mean, whether it's offshore wind or onshore wind or solar, there's a lot of people that gets affected if you build all these things. So in a Swedish context, and I think that's the same. So NIMBY not in my backyard, or banana build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So these kind of societal discussions that has to do with how do we share the burden of all this infrastructure that is actually needed to provide all this electricity. So I think it's really good to think about the volumes of electricity, and I think it's crucial that we do that and think about it. But I'm actually not so concerned about the capital. I'm more concerned about the resources, get the permissions done, and have the processes in place to be able to build all this.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that. I completely agree with you. The most important thing is to get the understanding that the necessity of carbon dioxide-free electricity is huge, and we have to invest that in these types of equipment, especially windmills. And we also have to produce and build the storage, because when we have this huge development production of windmills, we have to balance out the impact. And that also means that we have to have a total picture, how much and how intensive will the increase in wind generated electricity be, how will the infrastructure be, and we also have to have a legislation that make it possible, because that is the absolutely largest obstacles now, and that is to get the environmental permits to do all these plants.
I mean, environmental permits is one thing, but also it occurs to me regulators need to play a part here. Would an accelerated carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU help drive forward hydrogen-based steel production? Because at the moment it's phased in over quite a long period, isn't it? Do you think that needs to be speeded up?
Yeah, I think that will be a crucial tool for EU to speed up the development of carbon dioxide-free steel. I think strongly, and that was also what Andreas said, the most important thing to pursue this transformation is to realize that the cost for carbon dioxide emission is high, and we have to take that into our calculations. If we can get a robust carbon dioxide free pricing, and we can show that it is in long term, how to say, competitive to produce carbon dioxide free, then of course that will pursue the transformation. So yes, I strongly believe in CBAM, and also that EU ETS is faded out as fast as possible.
We've just got a question coming from the audience, and Nicholas, it's probably one for you. And the viewer asks, by what mechanism should business inform consumers in an easy manner of their products' emissions impact before purchase?
Wow. Yeah, we have, of course, an obligation to inform our consumers. Now, we work in the business-to-business sector from the Volvo Group, and I can imagine that this question is even more valid if you're working in the business-to-consumer frame, of course. But we of course, have to pronounce what we're doing, like we are now with the Science-Based Target Initiative. We will be clear the different steps that Volvo is taking year over year here in meeting the goals we've set up. And this will also, of course, lead to each and every product that we can sort of monitor and share information about the progress we're making from a CO2 perspective, but also other pollutants, so to say. When going electric means also that our vehicles will be more quiet and no other pollutants coming out besides the normal CO2 question we of course have in the center point.
Okay, just a quick question on standards, really. I mean, how do we get where we
I just want to say I have to leave now, so I wish you all the best. I have listened very carefully, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, just very quickly, because time is running out, just a question around standards. How do we make sure that people are buying green fossil fuel steel? Because it sort of occurs to me that we might have some plants running off blue hydrogen. I mean, can that be really considered green or not? Is there a part for the EU to play to come in and actually create some standards here so the consumer knows precisely what they are buying?
But that, I would say, would be the keystone for CBAM. You have to ensure what you are buying, if you are buying fossil-free steel, is actually that product. And we know today that manufacturing is more of assembling on a global market. So it will be crucial that we find a way of ensure where has this steel is originated from.
Okay. Would anyone else like to come in then at all? Andreas, I think.
No, I just underscore what John said, that this, to have a clear standard, because there won't be just one version, and it's just to be transparent on the different, and that's super crucial that it's being introduced as quickly as possible, because as you say, that will be key for customers to know what they buy, and it's also key for price realization for the players, that's part of the process, crucial, or sort of hard-coded into the buying behavior.
Okay. And just a final question for Araceli. Are there any other technologies out there that could help decarbonize the steel industry? We hear a bit about electrolysis. I mean, Are these things as viable as the green route that we've heard about, the green DRI route that we've heard about?
Well, there are indeed different routes that are being pursued. I mean, I would agree with the sentiment of the session. I mean, the most momentum we've seen and the latest developments are more on hydrogen-related routes, but still, certainly, I mean, on electrolysis, as you've mentioned, this is at earlier stages. We've seen some developments in Europe and in North America, but at a very much lower scale, we'd say more like a kind of a small pilots producing, certain kilos at this stage. But also, I mean, there's been some trials in the past and different projects looking at different components of the overall configuration for integrated carbon capture in a blast furnace under different configurations. Also, the utilization of some of the, let's say, waste gases coming off from blast furnaces to improve, in a way, the efficiencies that we see either in the blast furnaces or to produce other products that could be useful. So there are different developments out there. Smell reduction is another route that has been also pursued in Europe with the intention to integrate carbon capture in a more enhanced and better performing way. And plans are a bit in flux at the moment, as I understand. So indeed, there are other alternatives, but I would with the sentiment that in terms of let's say, level of readiness plus the, let's say, ambition and specific tangible plans for investments, hydrogen is possibly the route that has better prospects from that perspective.
Okay, well, listen, we are sadly out of time, but just to sum up, I think we have come to the conclusion that the hydrogen DRI route is emerging as the sort of the leading technical option to decarbonise the industry. But as we've heard from our panellists this afternoon, there are a number of issues still to overcome, whether it's regulatory support standards, trying to get the cost down, and the huge supply of electricity that will be needed. So I would just like to thank all of the panellists, Andreas, Nicholas, Araceli, and Jan. Thank you very much for sparing your time to discuss this subject. I'm sure we could have talked for a lot longer and there were a lot more issues to get through. But thank you very much for your contributions.